Today we are going to discuss Jean Piaget's 4 stages of cognitive development, or as some call it, the stages of child and adolescent development. First, let's talk about Piaget. He was a Swedish biologist who started studying in the 1920s, looking at the interactions between animals and their physical structures and their environment. He came to approach his study with humans the same way he did with animals, by seeing how biology affected them as well as philosophy. He combined the two studies, creating something called genetic epistemology. Now, why do we study Piaget in education? According to Richard DeLisi, in his article, The Educational Implications of Piaget's Theory and Assessment Techniques, we learned that this provides an analysis of knowledge and development, not just test scores. Sometimes we tend to know or want to know what kids know, but not necessarily why and how they are able to form those thoughts. In education, we also provide instructions in order to change or alter our students' ways of thinking. And maybe it is important to understand the biology of how this works and the development to understand how we can continue to change and alter students' ways of thinking. In addition, he studied child development for over 60 years. Some questions I want you to think about as we get started. 1, do you share the belief that only those who know how knowing comes to be are effective educators, and why? 2, which stage of cognitive development are the students that you serve or plan to serve currently in, and how do you know? 3, have you noticed any of these behaviors or responses from your students? Okay, in the beginning, Piaget was more concerned with how children conceptualize more abstract things like time or numbers or cause and effect relationships. A lot of people at this time thought that children were just dumber, smaller versions of adults. Piaget didn't believe that. He thought kids saw things just differently than the way that we see them. And eventually that the brain would grow and develop into the adult brain, and they would eventually be able to give adult responses. Now, in order to understand cognitive development, it's important that we break down that phrase. Development meaning, you know, how something grows and changes over time. Cognitive being the knowledge. And over time, Piaget thought that the brain and the knowledge would grow and develop into how adults think. In the beginning, Piaget was really big on something that we call object permanence. He was studying a child that he knew and realized that when this child was rolling the ball and it rolled away, the child would retrieve the ball. The issue was when the ball rolled away to somewhere the child could not see, let's say under the couch. And this child no longer thought that the object existed. And sometimes that leads to very unhappy babies, right? If an object is not permanent, then the baby thinks that the object is gone. It has disappeared simply because it is out of sight. And that's really a lot of our sensory motor stage. In the sensory motor stage, which is the first of 4 stages of cognitive development, we have the sense piece being the senses and the motor part being about motor skills. Our senses being touching, seeing, tasting, smelling, and hearing, and our motor skills, which is just how babies move their bodies and their muscles. In the sensory motor stage, we have substages. There are 6 of them. The first is reflexes, things that babies naturally know how to do. That can be sucking to get food, simply opening their eyes and looking at the things around them. At this time, it's good to give kids a stimulating environment because this is when they first start observing and looking for things around them. The second substage in the sensory motor stage is the primary circular reactions. This is when a baby will do something, notice that it is pleasurable, and continue manipulating their body in the same way, wiggling fingers, sucking thumbs, kicking, all of those things. The third being the circular reactions. It's about 4 to 8 months. And here is when babies start not only maneuvering their bodies, but maneuvering objects with them. That could be shaking rattles, chewing on toys. Now it's not just that something is pleasurable for the child, but also it's not just something they're doing within themselves, but also manipulating outside objects with those things. After that, we have the coordination of reactions. This is when babies are able to use actions to reach a desired goal, whether it's moving the toy around to the desired location, whether it's stacking The blocks on top of each other, the babies are maneuvering the physical world more so, moving things out of the way when they need to reach something, things of that nature. When the baby reaches about a year, they learn how to put things back together. They start stacking cups together. This is when they start kind of doing those experiments. The child smacking all the food off of the table, the child pouring milk on the table. All of those things go with understanding these reactions and moving things kind of like little experiments to see what the reaction is. The final part is when the child finally begins to form thoughts. And this is when, when you're playing peekaboo, when mommy no longer disappears, but when mommy is just behind the hands. This is when objects tend to be permanent. The toy didn't disappear, it's just under the blanket. And by about 2 years age, children start to understand that. So once again, the sensory motor stage is really just the baby using their senses and maneuvering their body. The next stage that Piaget looked at was the pre-operational stage. In the pre-operational stage, it's from about ages 2 to 7. This is when playing and symbolism is key, right? So playing house is very good because it lets kids get out of character and become somebody new. Roles that they have spent time observing from mommy and daddy are now very real things. They're encouraged to take on other characters. They're encouraged to play and make things out of things that aren't those things. For example, the box can definitely be a pirate ship. The stick can definitely be a horse. Play-Doh, manipulation, children can start taking things that are one thing and making them something else. Inside of the pre-operational stage, right, pre being before, operational, before they can perform some of the mental operations that we do now, a child lacks a couple things. They are very egocentric, and they lack this concept of conservation, so we can talk about those. Egocentrism is a child's lack of ability to see things from another perspective. So for example, if we were to ask this child how she sees the mountains, she would be able to tell us. She would be able to find out which of these views is the one that she's experiencing. If we were to ask her what this doll would see from their angle, she would think that that doll sees the same exact thing she does because they are both looking at the same thing. She's not yet able to see it from someone else's point of view. Another issue is conservation. A child lacks the ability to understand that quantity is irrelevant to physical appearance or arrangement of objects. Well, for example, if you give a child the 2 glasses of water and you ask which one has more, they will say that both glasses have the same. But if you take one of them and in front of that child's face, pour it into a taller, skinnier glass and ask the child which one has more, they're gonna say the taller one because it's bigger. It also goes for the arrangement of objects. Here we have 5 balls. You would ask them which line has more. They would say they both have the same. But when you come over here and you spread them out and you ask them which line has more, they would say the top one. Because for some reason, even though it still just has 5 balls, a child only sees it as being bigger. Concrete operational stage is when a child can perform some of the mental operations that we do, but only based on concrete evidence. This is before we really get into abstract thinking. So a child can arrange these pictures from smallest to largest because these are concrete things in front of them. But conceptualizing it without it actually being there would be the problem. This lasts from about ages 7 to 11, and there's a few different things that happen in this time. One is the child's ability to sort objects in an order. So if we were to ask them to sort out these toys, they would be able to do that after they have done. Another thing is classification. It's the ability to name and identify sets of objects. So if we were to ask them to pull all of the red objects and the orange objects and the yellow objects, the child would be able to do that. Also is this concept of transitivity, or the ability to recognize logical relationships. So if the banana is greater than the apple, and the apple is greater than the orange, then the banana must be greater than the apple, that must be greater than the orange. Children start to understand this, as well as reversibility, meaning that certain things can be done in reverse, like mathematical operations. They also now have this understanding of conservation, that just because it's spread out doesn't necessarily mean that there's more. And they also start understanding something we call decentering, taking into account multiple aspects of a problem to solve it. So now, instead of just seeing this tall skinny glass as having more, we take into account the fact that we saw them pour that same glass into that tube. Then we have the elimination of egocentrism. The child now has the ability to see from somebody else's perspective. So this child may very well now be able to see from the doll's point of view. The formal operational stage is the last stage that a child has. From about 11, they take it through adulthood. Now, formal adult logic and reasoning is now possible. This is interesting because children now have the ability to think logically, to problem solve more, and to think about those abstract concepts that we might not be too familiar with as smaller children. One thing that they can do is problem solve. While younger children may use trial and error to problem solve, adolescent children, 11, 12, older, start using logic to problem solve. They have more problem solving skills. While a younger child, younger than 11, may understand that adding or subtracting weights can change how the scale moves, a child 11 and older is going to not only understand that adding weights helps that, but even the placement of the weights and where they are on the scale affects it as well. In addition, abstract and hypothetical thinking. One of the questions that Piaget would ask would be to children is, if they had a third eye, where would they put it? Children younger than about 13 tended to say that if they had a third eye, it'd go right in the middle of their forehead. But the older that children got, they would start giving different answers. For example, some children would say they would put the third eye on their hand so that way they could see around corners or see in different places. Other students talked about putting it on the back of their head so they could see what was going on behind them. This is more abstract and hypothetical thinking. Another one was just abstract reasoning, for example, having the lines, and if those lines were to go in this order, logically, which would be the next line? Adults can tell us that the next line would be this one because they are going down, but children younger than 11 have a lot of trouble identifying and understanding that. Adults and adolescents, more so, now use visual aids. It is super important when teaching them, as well as opportunities to discuss social, political, and cultural issues. That can include religion, that can include politics, that can include justice, morality, more so what are your individual beliefs and what is your own opinion. Typically before 11, a child isn't seen to have that ability to form those relationships, those abstract concepts in their minds. In specifically me with teaching 7th grade, we learn about the Holocaust, we learn about slavery, we learn about politics, and it's very interesting to see that some students are in fact able to form opinions around these more abstract concepts, and some students still are not. And I think it's all about the variation in ages that we have inside the classroom. So back to these pre-discussion questions. 1, now that we've been through this, do you share the belief that only those who know how knowing comes to be are more effective educators? Why? Which stage of cognitive development are the students in that you serve or that you're planning to serve? And 3, have you noticed any of these behaviors or responses from your students? Now, we can apply all of this and have a better discussion now that we know a little bit more. Many have thought that implementing Piaget's task into curriculum as a means to better understand where their students are. Okay, so knowing that, would you consider incorporating the appropriate tasks into your classroom to better understand your students' level of development? And why? And also, some, like Vygotsky, critique Piaget by saying that a child's development has more to do with social context as well as language development than it does to do with age. Now, knowing that, do you believe that development happens over time in stages or that it is more based on social context and language? Let me know what you think.